Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time. Not to a battlefield or a royal court, but to a quiet, dimly lit café in 1890s Paris. The air is thick with the smell of tobacco and something else, something green and sweet. A little like licorice, maybe. You're sitting at a small, round table, and across from you, the flickering gaslight dances off a glass of an almost glowing emerald liquid. This, my friends, is absinthe, the infamous green fairy. And tonight, we're going to watch how this humble drink went from a mountain cure to the most controversial, creative, and destructive beverage of an entire generation. It was a drink that promised inspiration but delivered ruin. Or so they said. You probably won't survive this story without at least a mild urge to book a flight to Paris, just so you can get a taste of this history yourself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, oddly enough, doesn't start in the bustling, beautiful chaos of Paris. It begins in the sleepy, sun-drenched valleys of rural Switzerland. Sometime in the late 1700s, you're trudging up a rocky trail, the kind that smells of damp earth and pine needles, toward a small, whitewashed house nestled in the Val de Travers. This is the home of a French doctor in exile, Pierre Ordinaire. Now, whether Ordinaire was truly the inventor of absinthe is a point of a scholarly debate. Some historians still argue whether he created the drink or simply bought an existing recipe from the Unhurried sisters, two local herbalists who were already known for their medicinal concoctions. But for our purposes tonight, let's go with the story as it was told for centuries. Dr. Ordinaire, a man with a mind full of remedies and a desire for something more, was experimenting with local herbs. He was looking for something that could cure a variety of ailments, a kind of all-purpose tonic. And what did he find? He found wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, the very plant that gives absinthe its name, a plant with a long, almost mythical history of its own. He steeped this bitter herb, along with anise and fennel, in a high-proof alcohol. The result was a potent green elixir, which he bottled and sold as a medicinal cure-all. People used it for everything from digestive problems to fever. It was a potent and effective medicine, a bitter tincture that, with a little water, became a milky, opalescent green. It was, in its purest form, a sophisticated and complex herbal spirit. And for a while, that's all it was, a humble remedy sold in a quiet corner of the world. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit for you. The early versions of this absinthe weren't exactly what we think of today. They were often cloudy, with bits of sediment floating around, and they were generally consumed neat, or with a splash of water, more like a cough syrup than a cocktail. It was a far cry from the refined, clear green spirit that would soon capture the hearts and minds of a generation. It was an acquired taste, to be sure, but one that was gaining traction. The Unhurried sisters, if we believe the alternative history, were selling it as extrait d'absinthe, a sort of old-school brand name that sounds much more elegant than it probably was. In 1797, a man named Major Dubied bought the recipe from Ordinaire, or maybe from the Unhurried sisters, again. That's a debate for another time, and opened the first commercial absinthe distillery in Cuvée, Switzerland. He brought his son and son-in-law into the business, and together, they built a small but successful enterprise. The drink was still seen as a medicinal tonic, a high-end curiosity for those who could afford it. You can almost see their modest factory in your mind's eye. The gentle hiss of steam, the sharp, pungent scent of the herbs filling the air, a quiet and unassuming beginning for a drink that would soon be anything but. They called their new company Pernod Fils. Remember that name. It's going to be very important later on. Because what happened next was the thing that always happens to good ideas. They get swept up by a bigger world. And the bigger world was hungry for a new sensation. As you drift forward in time, the quiet, herbal hills of Switzerland fade away, replaced by the chaotic, vibrant energy of late 19th century Paris. The city is a masterpiece of light and shadow, a fever dream of grand boulevards and crowded, bohemian alleys. The air now smells of freshly baked bread, coal smoke, and something else. Something sharp and inviting that seems to be calling to you from every corner cafe. This is the Belle Epoque, a time of unprecedented peace and artistic explosion. And in this world of can-can dancers, top hats, and grand paintings, absinthe finally found its true home. It was no longer just a humble medicine from a Swiss apothecary. The French military had played an unexpected role in its rise, using absinthe as a malaria preventative and a water purifier during their campaigns in North Africa in the 1840s. The soldiers developed a taste for it, and when they returned to France, they brought their craving with them. The demand grew, and a simple cure-all transformed into a fashionable, exotic drink. It first caught on among the bohemian artists, writers, and poets who were the lifeblood of Montmartre and the Latin Quarter. You can almost see them now, hunched over small tables, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a single gas lamp, discussing art, politics, and philosophy with a fervent passion. For these starving artists, absinthe was more than just a drink, it was a muse. It was cheap, potent, and it promised a doorway to a different way of seeing the world. They believed it unlocked their creative minds, stripping away the mundane and revealing a more profound, truer reality. Think of the names: Edward Manet, with his famous painting, The Absinthe Drinker, or Edgar Degas, whose L'Absinthe depicts a woman with a haunted, vacant stare, her absinthe glass sitting on the table before her, a symbol of urban alienation. And of course, there's Vincent van Gogh, whose troubled genius and legendary ear-severing were later, and perhaps unfairly, tied to his love for the drink. It became an integral part of their artistic identity, a symbol of their rebellion against bourgeois society. The cafés themselves became the temples of this new religion. Le Chat Noir, the legendary cabaret, was a famous haunt, its walls echoing with the laughter and heated debates of the most brilliant minds in Europe. The Café de la Nouvelle Athènes, immortalized in Degas' painting, was another popular spot. You can picture yourself walking past their large glass windows, peering inside at the throngs of people, each with a glass of the green liquid glowing softly in their hand. It was an exclusive club at first, a secret shared by the artistic elite. But absinthe's popularity was a fire that couldn't be contained. Its fame trickled down from the artists and writers to the wider public. Its allure fueled by a potent mix of romanticism and curiosity. Suddenly, the common man and woman wanted a taste of the bohemian life. They wanted to feel what the great painters and poets felt. Historians still argue whether absinthe caused this cultural explosion or merely rode its wave. But there's no doubt the drink became synonymous with this new era of creative freedom. It was a fringe tidbit, a secret handshake among a small group, but it had now broken free, ready to sweep through the city. This widespread acceptance was not without its critics. Even in these early days, there were whispers. The drink was too strong. They said, it led to ruin. They warned, but their voices were drowned out by the clinking of glasses and the roar of a city that had fallen head over heels in love. The Pernod Fils Company, which we met in the last section, had opened its first distillery in France and was now producing absinthe on a massive, industrial scale, satisfying the insatiable thirst of the Parisian public. Its once humble origins in a Swiss valley now seemed a lifetime away. Absinthe was no longer just a drink, it was an identity, a symbol of a new era. And Paris was its stage. As you settle into your seat at one of the bustling Parisian cafés, a waiter glides to your table. You watch him with a drowsy, almost hypnotic fascination. He doesn't bring a simple drink, he brings the tools for a ritual. The act of drinking absinthe wasn't a quick gulp or a casual sip, it was a performance. A deliberate and mesmerizing ceremony that became as famous as the drink itself. This was the key to its allure, a little piece of theater that made the experience feel special and almost mystical. You'll soon be a part of it. First, the waiter places a tall, stemmed glass before you. It's filled with a measure of the brilliant, translucent green liquid, so vibrant it seems to contain a living light. Next, he sets down a small carafe of ice-cold water and, finally, the most iconic tool of all, the perforated absinthe spoon. The spoon is a work of art in its own right, often made of silver or intricately designed metal, with a series of tiny holes or slots. This is a crucial element of the ritual, the gateway to the green fairy. You are now the master of this small ceremony. You take a lump of sugar and place it on the slotted spoon. carefully balancing it over the top of your glass. Then, slowly, almost as if you're administering a potent medicine, you begin to drip the icy water from the carafe onto the sugar cube. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop lands on the sugar, dissolving it, and carrying the sweet, syrupy mixture down into the absinthe below. And this is where the magic happens. The clear, jewel-toned green liquid begins to cloud, transforming before your eyes. It turns into a milky, opalescent shade of pale green, sometimes with a subtle pearlescent shimmer. This process is called the louche, from the French word for opaque or cloudy, and it's caused by the essential oils of the herbs, especially anise, that are soluble in alcohol but not in water. When the water is added, the oils are released from their alcoholic embrace and form a cloudy suspension. This sensory transformation was a huge part of absinthe's appeal. It wasn't just a chemical reaction, it was a kind of alchemy. The slow, patient dripping of water allowed for a moment of quiet contemplation in the middle of a noisy, chaotic café. It was a meditative practice before meditation was a thing, and the reward was a drink that tasted remarkably different from the initial harsh liquor. The bitterness of the wormwood and the bite of the alcohol were softened by the sugar, and the aromas of the herbs, fennel, anise, and the distinct scent of wormwood, were released into the air. While this ritual was the standard for the upper echelons of society and the artistic bohemians, a quirky little tidbit is that for the working-class consumer, things were a bit less theatrical. Often, they'd just dump the water into the glass, sometimes from a simple pitcher, without the sugar cube or the fancy spoon. It was the same drink, of course, but it lost the mystique, becoming a quick, potent way to forget the day's troubles. Historians still argue whether this simpler, faster consumption was a factor in the later perception of absinthe as a lower-class drink associated with social decay. But for now, you're experiencing the full, romanticized version. The sheer volume of absinthe consumed during this period is a mainstream historical fact that's truly astonishing. By the early 1900s, France was drinking an estimated 36 million liters of absinthe annually. This wasn't a niche product, it was a national obsession. Its popularity was so immense that a single Parisian street, the Rue de Lappe, was home to dozens of bars, many of which served little else but absinthe. The sight of all those tables, each with its own little carafe and spoon, and all those glasses undergoing the magical louche, was a daily spectacle. The ritual wasn't just a gimmick, it was the very heart of the experience. A slow, deliberate act that promised an escape from the frantic pace of modern life. One hypnotic drip at a time. It was a promise that, for a while at least, the world was more beautiful and more interesting with the green fairy at your side. Now that you've mastered the ritual, you're ready to hear about the incredible, and often exaggerated, effects of this strange drink. The legend of the green fairy wasn't built on taste alone, it was built on a powerful myth. One that promised a shortcut to genius. For the artists and writers, the attraction was rooted in a very mainstream historical fact: the widespread belief that absinthe was a powerful hallucinogen. It wasn't just alcohol, it was a mind-altering substance that could unlock a different plane of consciousness. It was believed that the thujone, a chemical compound found in wormwood, was a psychedelic, a kind of natural LSD that would transport you from the grimy realities of Paris to a world of vivid, feverish visions. The stories of absinthe-fueled madness and creativity are endless. Take the case of Vincent van Gogh. It's a quirky tidbit, but a persistent legend claims he cut off his ear in a fit of absinthe-induced delirium. While modern historians and scientists have largely debunked this, arguing that his mental illness was far more complex and likely not caused by absinthe alone. The story became a powerful piece of the drink's mythology. It suggested that absinthe could both create and destroy, that it was a double-edged sword that granted genius at the risk of insanity. Pablo Picasso, a fellow Parisian resident, also had a complicated relationship with the drink. His famous 1901 painting, The Absinthe Drinker, depicts a solitary, slumped woman, seemingly lost in the stupor of her drink. The work captures the darker, more melancholy side of the absinthe craze, a side that we'll be exploring in more detail soon. But for now, you see that the myth was so pervasive that even the most celebrated artists were willingly, or perhaps unwillingly, associated with it. They were both the subjects and the creators of its legend. Historians still argue whether the effects of absinthe were truly unique or if they were simply the result of consuming a very high-proof alcohol in large quantities. The absinthe of the era was often 70% alcohol or more, far stronger than wine or beer, which were the typical drinks of the time. The thujone levels in the wormwood were actually quite low, and modern scientific analysis has shown that you would die from alcohol poisoning long before you ingested enough thujone to cause hallucinations. The drink's effects, while real, were likely a combination of severe drunkenness, poor diet, and the existing mental health issues of the people who drank it. But for the creative class of the 1890s, this didn't matter. They were looking for an excuse to be different, to be rebellious, to break free from the constraints of a rigid society. The idea that a single drink could unlock their true potential was far too romantic to ignore. They weren't just getting drunk, they were chasing the green fairy. A seductive, ethereal muse who promised to whisper secrets of art and poetry into their ears. The myth was more potent than the drink itself. Remember the quiet apothecary from our first section? The humble little cure-all has now been transformed into a powerful cultural symbol. It's a testament to the power of a good story. A narrative so compelling that it overshadowed reality. The artists told the story. The public believed it, and soon, absinthe became not just a drink, but a character in the grand, unfolding drama of Parisian life. And as we'll see in the next section, this daily drama was about to take on a very specific and very public form. The clock in the distance, perhaps on the tower of a grand public building, chimes 5 o'clock. The sound isn't a simple signal of the hour. It's a call to arms for the weary and the creative alike. As if on cue, the cafés, which were merely buzzing before, suddenly overflow with people. This is the green hour, or allure verte, a mainstream historical fact and a daily ritual that defined Parisian life. It was the moment the city took a collective breath, a pause between the end of the workday and the start of the evening's entertainment. It was the Parisian equivalent of a modern-day happy hour, but with far more mystique and a lot more drama. You watch as clerks, artists, poets, and even members of the bourgeoisie fill every available seat. The air, which was once filled with the mundane sounds of the city, now hums with the clinking of glasses and the delicate, rhythmic drip of water into absinthe. It's a beautiful, almost hypnotic symphony. The light from the setting sun streams through the windows, illuminating the milky green glasses, making them glow like little vials of liquid magic. The green hour wasn't just a time, it was a state of mind. A moment of escape. For the artist, it was a time to find inspiration. For the clerk, it was a time to forget the drudgery of the office. For everyone, it was a shared experience. A moment of communal release. A quirky tidbit is that this daily ritual was so ingrained in the culture that entire industries sprang up around it. Absinthe fountains, large, ornate glass vessels with multiple spouts and taps, became a common sight in the more luxurious cafés, allowing multiple patrons to perform the dripping ritual at once. They were beautiful, functional, and added an extra layer of theatricality to the experience. They looked less like bar equipment and more like elegant scientific instruments. Imagine the scene. A circle of people gathered around a bubbling fountain, each one patiently waiting for their turn to fill their glass and perform the transformative louche. This period of unparalleled popularity was a gold rush for absinthe producers. The Pernod Fils Company, which started in that quiet Swiss valley, was now a multinational giant. Their brand, along with a few others, was a household name. This was a time when a simple drink had become a national institution. It was celebrated in song, immortalized in paintings, and at the center of countless conversations. It was the drink of freedom, of rebellion, of art, and of passion. But you can feel a subtle tension in the air. Not everyone was celebrating. The social problems associated with absinthe were starting to become visible. The working-class man who drank it to excess, sometimes instead of eating, was becoming a common sight. The bohemian artist, once a romantic figure, was starting to look more like a cautionary tale. Historians still argue whether the societal problems were caused by absinthe itself or if the drink was simply a symptom of a larger issue: poverty, mental illness, and a lack of social safety nets. But for the general public and the growing number of critics, the distinction was blurring. The green hour was a beautiful spectacle. a testament to absinthe's cultural dominance. But as the clock continued to tick, and the glasses continued to fill, the light on the drink was starting to change. The beautiful emerald glow was beginning to look a little menacing, a little too powerful. The green fairy was no longer just a muse, she was starting to look a lot like a demon. And her reign, as beautiful and glorious as it was about to face some serious opposition. As you watch the last of the Green Hour's patrons stumble out of the cafe, you feel a shift in the city's mood. The initial romance and bohemian allure of absinthe are being replaced by a darker, more serious concern. The green fairy, once a muse, is now being framed as a social menace. This shift in perception is a mainstream historical fact, and it marks a turning point in our story. Absinthe's reach had expanded far beyond the artist's studios and into the lives of the working class. It was no longer a symbol of rebellion, for many. It had become a symbol of despair. The sheer volume of absinthe being consumed was a significant factor. It was cheap, powerful, and widely available for a working man or woman struggling with long hours and low wages. A glass of absinthe offered a potent and immediate escape, but it was an escape with a high cost. A quirky tidbit is that during this time, many of the cheaper, mass-produced absinthes were of questionable quality. To cut costs, some distillers would use industrial alcohol, or they'd substitute the expensive herbs with things like copper sulfate to create the signature green color. The effects of these adulterated drinks were far more toxic than pure absinthe, leading to a host of health problems that were all blamed on the drink as a whole. The term absinthism emerged to describe a supposed syndrome linked to chronic absinthe consumption. It was said to cause a specific set of symptoms: sleeplessness, tremors, convulsions, and even hallucinations. It was believed to be a distinct form of alcoholism, one that was far more dangerous. The image of the absinthe-addled man, pale, trembling, and violent, became a powerful piece of public propaganda. The drink was no longer just a source of intoxication, it was being blamed for a rise in crime, violence, and social decay. This growing social concern had a very specific target: the working class. The middle and upper classes, who also drank absinthe, were largely seen as capable of moderating their own intake. But for the impoverished and uneducated, the drink was framed as a poison that would destroy their bodies, their minds, and their families. It was an easy narrative to sell, and it found fertile ground among temperance movements and social reformers who were already concerned about the effects of alcohol on society. Historians still argue whether absinthism was a real, distinct illness or simply a moral panic fueled by the existing anxieties of a rapidly changing society. There's no doubt that heavy alcohol consumption, especially of a high-proof spirit, can cause serious health problems. But was there something uniquely dangerous about absinthe beyond its high alcohol content? It's a debate that continues to this day. But for the people of 1890's Paris, the verdict was already decided. They saw the problems firsthand, and they were looking for a simple, single cause. Absinthe, with its strange ritual and its exotic name, was a perfect scapegoat. The Green Fairy was no longer a symbol of creative rebellion. She was being unmasked as a dangerous imp, a beautiful monster who lured people to their ruin. This changing public perception set the stage for a dramatic backlash. The stage was set, and the battle lines were being drawn. Absinthe, once the darling of the Parisian art scene, was about to face its most formidable opponent yet: the collective judgment of an increasingly alarmed society. The growing moral panic wasn't just a whisper in the cafes, it was about to get a public, scientific face. As you follow the narrative, you're now a spectator in the halls of early scientific inquiry. The doctors and scientists of the late 19th century were trying to understand this strange new malady, absinthism, and their conclusions, while flawed by today's standards, became a powerful weapon in the anti-absinthe campaign. They believed there was something uniquely dangerous about the drink, something beyond mere drunkenness. The central figure in this scientific debate was a French chemist named Jules Pierre Magnin. In 1872, he conducted a series of experiments on the effects of wormwood oil on animals, and his findings were dramatic. He injected pure wormwood oil into guinea pigs and dogs, observing that the animals suffered from convulsions, tremors, and severe muscle contractions. His conclusion was startling and widely publicized: wormwood oil, and by extension absinthe, was a powerful neurotoxin that caused a specific form of epilepsy like madness. This was a mainstream historical fact, and it gave the anti-absinthe movement the scientific credibility they desperately needed. But here's a quirky tidbit about Magnan's experiments. He wasn't using absinthe itself, but a highly concentrated, purified form of wormwood oil. The amount of thujone he injected into his animals was exponentially higher than anything a human could ever consume from a glass of absinthe. To get the same dose, a person would have to drink a gallon of absinthe in a single sitting. And they would die from alcohol poisoning long before the thujone had a chance to do its damage. This key detail was conveniently overlooked or misunderstood by the public and the press. The headlines didn't say, "Scientist finds pure wormwood oil is dangerous." They said, "Absinthe drives people mad." This scientific evidence provided a crucial link between the drink and its perceived social ills. It was no longer just a question of morality, it was now a matter of public health. Absinthe was a poison, a specific agent of a specific disease. The drink became a symbol of national degeneration, a force that was weakening the French population from within. The public was told that the very fabric of society was at risk. It was a potent message. Historians still argue whether Magnan was a genuine, if misguided, scientist or a willing accomplice in a larger political campaign. The wine industry, as we'll see later, was a powerful force, and having a well-respected chemist declare absinthe a neurotoxin was a huge victory for them. It's entirely possible that Magnan's research was simply a product of its time. Early toxicology was a new field, and the scientific method wasn't as rigorous as it is today, but the result was the same. The science, however flawed, was a powerful tool for those who wanted to see the green fairy banished forever. This newfound scientific backing set the stage for a full-scale assault on absinthe. The moral and social arguments were now reinforced by the cold, hard facts of science, and the public's fear began to turn into a full-throttled outrage. The Bohemian Muse had been rebranded as a toxic drug, and its days were beginning to look numbered. The stage was set for a political showdown that would decide the fate of the Green Fairy once and for all. Now, let's add another layer to our story. The growing health concerns and scientific evidence didn't exist in a vacuum. They were fueled by the national mood. Especially in the wake of the devastating Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71. The humiliating defeat left France searching for answers, a reason for their loss. This led to a pervasive feeling of national decline, a sort of collective depression that made the public receptive to the idea of a corrupting influence. Absinthe, the new drink on the block, was a perfect target. This is a mainstream historical fact. In times of crisis, a nation often looks for a scapegoat. The French defeat was seen not just as a military failure, but a moral one. The military and political leaders of the time began to suggest that the French populace had become weak and soft, lacking the moral fiber to stand up to their disciplined German neighbors. Absinthe, with its reputation for causing madness and moral decay, was easily framed as the very cause of this weakness. The Green Fairy became a symbol of national vice, a foreign poison that was rotting the French soul from the inside out. A quirky tidbit that highlights this is how the temperance movement, which was already active, shifted its focus. While they had traditionally been against all alcohol, they began to single out absinthe as the most egregious threat. They used a phrase that you can almost hear them chanting: "Absinthe has conquered France more than Germany ever could." It was a powerful, emotional message that resonated with a public still smarting from defeat. They weren't just fighting a drink, they were fighting for the soul of the nation. Historians still argue whether the war simply provided the perfect context for an existing anti-absinthe sentiment or if the drink was genuinely seen as a cause of the defeat. Was it just convenient timing? Or did a nation in mourning genuinely believe that a green liquor was to blame for its military shortcomings? The answer likely lies somewhere in the middle. The drink was already causing social problems, but the political and nationalistic narratives gave the movement a new, much more powerful angle. This nationalist propaganda was incredibly effective. It moved the debate from a moral and medical one to a patriotic one. If you drank absinthe, you weren't just a drunk, you were an unpatriotic citizen, a man, or woman, who was contributing to the slow decline of your own country. The wine industry, as we'll see in the next section, was about to take advantage of this sentiment in a big way. They had their own reasons for wanting absinthe gone, and the public's fear and patriotism were the perfect tools for the job. The Green Fairy, once a symbol of artistic freedom, was now the enemy of the state. As you continue to observe the unfolding drama, you realize that the moral outrage and scientific concerns were just two players on a much larger stage. The third and perhaps most powerful player was the French wine industry. This is a mainstream historical fact that provides the crucial economic context for absinthe's downfall. For centuries, French wine had been a point of national pride and a cornerstone of the economy. The phylloxera epidemic of the mid-19th century had devastated the vineyards. But by the 1890s, they were recovering, and the wine industry was a powerful political force. They saw absinthe not just as a cultural threat, but as a direct economic competitor. Think about it. The Green Hour wasn't just a time for absinthe. It was a time when people could have been drinking wine. Absinthe was often cheaper, more potent, and therefore more efficient at delivering a buzz. A working-class man might have 1 or 2 glasses of absinthe, whereas he would need a liter of wine to get the same effect. This directly impacted the bottom line of the wine producers, who had powerful allies in government and the media. The rivalry was a silent war, fought with propaganda and political maneuvering. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this is a famous anti-absinthe poster from the era that was, surprisingly, not funded by temperance groups, but by a consortium of wine producers. The poster often showed a robust, happy peasant raising a glass of wine, while a pale, gaunt figure, clearly an absinthe drinker, crouched in the shadows. The message was subtle but powerful. Wine was the drink of health, tradition, and patriotism, while absinthe was the drink of ruin and moral decay. This wasn't a grassroots movement, it was a well-funded smear campaign. Historians still argue whether the wine lobby's influence was the primary driver of the ban or if they simply exploited an existing moral panic. It's easy to see the narrative of a powerful industry taking down a rival. But the truth is likely more complex. The moral panic was real, and the scientific evidence was compelling to a public looking for a scapegoat. But the wine industry provided the financial backing and political pressure to turn sentiment into law. They didn't create the fire, but they certainly poured gasoline on it. This economic rivalry was a hidden force, a powerful undercurrent beneath the public spectacle of moral outrage. The Green Fairy wasn't just a symbol of vice, she was also a symbol of a new, industrial form of production that threatened to usurp a centuries-old tradition. The old guard, represented by the winemakers, was fighting back against the new. The battle for the soul of France wasn't just about art and morality, it was also about money. And as the saying goes, money talks. It was a perfect storm of social anxiety, scientific misinformation, and powerful economic interests, all conspiring to bring down a single drink. The stage was set for the final, brutal campaign against the Green Fairy. The whispers and campaigns finally coalesced into a loud, undeniable roar. You are now a witness to the public's full-throttled assault on absinthe. The anti-absinthe sentiment, fueled by a perfect storm of moral panic, flawed science, and economic rivalry, moved from the backrooms of government to the streets and newspapers of France. This is a mainstream historical fact. The moment a cultural trend became a national crisis, the Green Fairy was no longer just a drink, she was a political cause. Propaganda posters, this is a quirky tidbit, became a common sight. They were powerful, emotional, and often graphic. You can almost see them plastered on brick walls, weathered by the rain. One such poster might show a happy, healthy family drinking a glass of water, with the father looking strong and moral. Next to them, a sickly, miserable family is hunched over a table, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, with a bottle of absinthe ominously glowing in the background. The message was clear: absinthe destroys families. Another might show a grotesque, green-hued demon with a glass of absinthe in hand, tempting a virtuous young man. These weren't subtle messages, they were a direct assault on the drink's reputation. Using fear and moralizing to turn public opinion. Petitions circulated, often initiated by temperance groups and quietly supported by the wine lobby. Thousands of signatures were collected, demanding that the government take action. Public rallies were held, with speakers railing against the green menace and calling for a total ban. The sentiment was so strong that even some of the most famous artists and writers who had once celebrated the drink began to distance themselves from it. They couldn't ignore the social decay and the public's growing disgust. The symbol of rebellion had become a symbol of disgrace. Historians still argue whether this public outcry was a genuine grassroots movement or a cleverly orchestrated campaign by powerful interests. The truth is likely a combination of both. There was real, palpable fear and anger among the general public who saw the damage the drink was causing in their communities. But this genuine sentiment was amplified and directed by the very groups that stood to gain the most from a ban. The public's anxieties were the fuel, and the wine lobby and temperance groups were the engine. The narrative was simple and effective. Absinthe was framed as a foreign poison, an enemy from without that had infiltrated the country from its humble Swiss beginnings. It was contrasted with wine, the traditional, patriotic drink of France, the drink of moderation and health. It was a classic us versus them narrative, a powerful tool that united a nation behind a single cause. The campaign was working, and the public's fear was reaching a boiling point. But it was a single event, a brutal and tragic crime, that would provide the final, devastating blow, the moment that turned opinion into action. The fate of the Green Ferry was about to be sealed in a courtroom. The scattered fears and political maneuvers finally found their focal point in a single, brutal event. This is where our narrative takes a dark, tragic turn. You are a juror in a Swiss courtroom. The year is 1905, and the case before you is that of Jean Lanfray. This is a mainstream historical fact and the last nail in Absinthe's coffin. Lanfray, a French farm worker living in a small Swiss village, was a man with a troubled past and a known love for drink. On a hot summer's day, he had a drink of absinthe before work, another 2 after, and a few more in the late afternoon. He wasn't a saint, he also drank wine and brandy. But it was the absinthe that was put on trial. When Lanfray returned home that day, a heated argument erupted between him and his pregnant wife. The details are messy and disputed, but the end result was horrific. In a fit of rage, he took a rifle and shot his wife and 2 young daughters, killing them instantly. He then turned the gun on himself but survived. The crime was shocking and made international headlines. The question wasn't if he was guilty, but why, and the answer, for the public and for the prosecutors, was simple and singular: absinthe. The defense, to its credit, argued that Lanfray was a chronic alcoholic who had been drinking for years and that absinthe was just one of many poisons he consumed. They pointed to the fact that he had also drunk a significant amount of wine and brandy that day. But the prosecution, and the public, were not interested in nuance. They seized upon the quirky tidbit that Lanfray had only had 2 glasses of wine and a small glass of brandy, but had consumed 2 absinthes. The amount seemed small, but the drink itself was seen as the agent of the crime. The defense was fighting a cultural narrative, not just the facts of the case. The prosecution's argument was powerful and resonated with the public's existing fears. Absinthe had driven him mad, causing him to commit an act of unspeakable violence. It wasn't just a simple case of drunken rage, it was a case of absinthism, the disease that Magnan had proven existed. The trial was a media circus, and the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Lanfray was convicted of murder, and the crime became the definitive proof that absinthe was a public menace. The Green Fairy had finally shown her true, murderous colors. Historians still argue whether the Lanfray case was the direct cause of the absinthe ban or if it was merely the spark that lit an already prepared fuse. The political and economic pressures were already in place, and the public was already primed for a moral panic. But the brutal, real-life consequences of the crime were undeniable. It gave a face to the abstract fears of social decay and madness. It was a perfect, tragic story for the anti-absinthe movement, providing them with the emotional leverage they needed to push their agenda over the finish line. The Lanfray murders became the final, irrefutable evidence that a ban was not just desirable, but necessary. The tragedy of the Lanfray murders sent shockwaves across Europe, but its most powerful effect was in France. The public, already primed for a moral panic, now had a single, terrifying example of the Green Fairy's alleged destructive power. This is a mainstream historical fact and the moment our story reaches its climax. The political pressure to act was now overwhelming, and the government, faced with a united front of moral reformers, economic rivals, and a terrified public, finally gave in. On March 16, 1915, the French Chamber of Deputies passed a law to ban the production and sale of absinthe and other similar spirits. It was a swift, decisive move that brought an end to over a century of legal absinthe production in France. The vote was a near unanimous victory for the anti-absinthe forces. It wasn't just a law, it was a cultural shift, an admission that the drink had become a public enemy. The ban was enacted with a sense of moral certainty, a feeling that France was finally ridding itself of a great evil. A quirky tidbit about the ban is that while it was aimed squarely at absinthe, the law was intentionally vague, targeting spirits with wormwood, to prevent distillers from simply changing the name and continuing to produce the same drink. This was a smart move by the legislators, a testament to how seriously they took the perceived threat. It also meant that other, less popular spirits with wormwood were also swept up in the ban, a sort of collateral damage in the war against the Green Fairy. The immediate aftermath was a strange mix of relief and mourning. For the temperance advocates and the wine lobby, it was a moment of triumph. For the bohemian artists and the many working people who still enjoyed the drink, it was a moment of sadness and a sign that a free-spirited era was coming to an end. The cafés of Paris, once a sea of milky green, began to fill with a different drink, pastis. Made with anise but no wormwood, pastis was a clever and legal substitute. It looked and tasted somewhat similar, but it lacked the crucial ingredient and, more importantly, the mythical allure of the Green Fairy. Historians still argue whether the ban was an overreaction to a genuine problem or a political and economic power play disguised as a public health issue. There's no doubt that heavy alcohol consumption was a major problem in France at the time. But absinthe was singled out in a way that wine and other spirits were not. The ban was a potent symbol of a society choosing order and tradition over chaos and artistic freedom. The Green Fairy, once a beloved muse, was now an outlaw, a forbidden spirit whose very name would soon be whispered in hushed tones. Her existence relegated to the black markets and the history books. This was the end of an era. But as with all things forbidden, it was also the beginning of something new. The ban had been enacted, but you can't simply erase a century of tradition and a powerful craving with the stroke of a pen. The Green Fairy had gone underground, but she hadn't disappeared. For many, the thrill of the forbidden was a powerful draw. This is a mainstream historical fact. Prohibition, whether of alcohol or other substances, often creates a thriving black market. Absinthe was no exception. Suddenly, the sleek, elegant absinthe spoons and ornate fountains were replaced by a shadowy, illicit trade. Small, independent distillers, often in the countryside, began to produce illegal batches of the spirit. They were often working in secret, using makeshift stills and risking severe penalties if caught. A quirky tidbit about this underground production is that the quality of these illicit absinthes was wildly inconsistent. Some were still made with traditional recipes, while others were cheap, dangerous concoctions made with industrial alcohol and artificial coloring. It was a risky game for both the producer and the consumer. You didn't know if the glass in your hand was a lovingly crafted spirit or a poisonous imitation. The Parisian cafés that once celebrated the green hour were now discreetly serving the illegal drink in the back rooms. To a select and trusted clientele, a secret password or a subtle nod was all it took to get a glass. The familiar sound of water dripping over sugar was replaced by the hushed whispers of clandestine deals. The ritual was gone, but the spirit, both literally and figuratively, lived on. Smuggling networks emerged, bringing absinthe from neighboring Switzerland and Spain, where it was still legal. The image of a smuggler, carrying a box of the forbidden green bottles across a dark, moonlit border, became a romantic and rebellious one. The Green Fairy had been transformed from a bohemian muse into a symbol of defiance against an overly moralizing government. Historians still argue whether the ban was more harmful than the open sale of absinthe. On the one hand, it stopped the mass consumption that had led to so many social problems. On the other, it drove the problem underground, making the product unregulated, untaxed, and potentially more dangerous. The government had won the public battle, but they had created a new, hidden war against illicit spirits. For decades, absinthe was a ghost, a legend whispered about in back alleys and smoky bars. It was the stuff of old stories, a relic from a different, wilder time. The younger generation grew up with no knowledge of the ritual or the green hour. Only the stories of its dangerous, mind-altering past. The green fairy had become a myth, but a resilient one. She was waiting in the shadows, waiting for the day she could once again step back into the light. For decades, the green fairy was a forgotten relic, a scandalous footnote in the history of France. But as the 20th century wore on, something began to change. The fervor of the temperance movement faded, and the strict moral codes of the Belle Époque gave way to a more liberal, open-minded world. This is a mainstream historical fact. Bans rarely last forever, especially when the reasons for them are based on outdated science and moral panics. Absinthe's long, slow road to return began quietly, in the backrooms of European legislatures. The first crack in the dam came in the 1980s. A small company in the Czech Republic, taking advantage of a loophole in an old law, began to produce and sell a version of absinthe. It wasn't the same. It was a simplified spirit, often with a less complex flavor profile, and it lacked the crucial ritual. But it was a start. It introduced a new generation to the name, if not the essence, of the green fairy. A quirky tidbit about this period is that the drink became a kind of cult favorite among travelers and backpackers, who would bring bottles back home as a kind of exotic, forbidden souvenir. The scientific consensus had also shifted. By the late 1990s, the flawed science of Jules Pierre Magnin had been thoroughly debunked. Modern analysis, using advanced techniques, found that the levels of thujone in pre-ban absinthes were far too low to cause the hallucinatory effects that were once attributed to them. The absinthism syndrome was re-evaluated, and most researchers concluded it was simply a severe form of alcoholism, fueled by poor nutrition and an extremely high alcohol content. The myth of the mind-altering green fairy was finally put to rest, replaced by a much more mundane, but still powerful, reality. It was just a strong drink. Historians still argue whether the lifting of the ban was a true triumph of scientific reason or simply the result of changing cultural attitudes. It's likely a bit of both. The science provided the perfect justification, but the public's appetite for new and exotic spirits was the real driving force. The romanticism of the past was coming back into style. People weren't just looking for a drink, they were looking for a story. And absinthe had one of the best stories of them all. In the early 2000s, as countries like Switzerland, Spain, and finally France began to re-legalize absinthe, the green fairy was allowed to return home. But she returned with a new reputation. No longer a dangerous muse or a social menace. She was now a sophisticated, historic spirit. The old Prohibition-era fears were gone, replaced by a new appreciation for craftsmanship and tradition. The stage was set for the final act of our story. You are now in a sleek, modern bar, maybe in Paris, maybe in New York, maybe somewhere in between. The year is today. The bartender, dressed in a crisp vest, doesn't just pour a drink, he presents an experience. This is the final chapter of our story, the rebirth of the green fairy. Absinthe is no longer a social menace or an outlawed poison, it is a refined, celebrated spirit. The new absinthe is a far cry from the dodgy, industrial concoctions of the past. It is crafted with care, often by small, independent distillers who follow the original 19th century recipes. They use high-quality, natural ingredients and pay close attention to the traditional distillation process. This is a mainstream historical fact. The modern absinthe revival is all about authenticity and tradition. There is a newfound appreciation for the art of distillation, and the focus has shifted from potency to flavor and complexity. You can now find a variety of styles, from the blanche absinthe, which is clear and often less bitter, to the traditional verte, with its beautiful green hue. The ritual of the spoon and sugar cube is back, not as a desperate act of masking a bitter medicine, but as a genuine part of the tasting experience. The fountains have returned, too, now seen as elegant pieces of bar equipment rather than tools of moral decay. The green fairy has been redeemed, her reputation cleansed by time and a return to quality. A quirky tidbit about modern absinthe is that many brands are now marketing themselves with a nod to the drink's rebellious and artistic past. They use labels that look like old Art Nouveau posters and tell the stories of the famous painters and writers who once drank it. The very myths that led to the drink's downfall are now being used to sell it. A testament to the power of a good story. Historians still argue whether this modern absinthe revival is a genuine return to tradition or a commercialized, sanitized version of a once dangerous drink. It's a valid question. The wild, unregulated absinthe of the 1890s was a different beast entirely. It was a drink of chaos, of unbridled artistic energy and social decay. The modern absinthe, with its regulated alcohol content and carefully measured ingredients, is a drink of order, of controlled appreciation. It lacks the wild, unpredictable edge of its ancestor. But perhaps that's for the best. And so, we bring our journey to a close. From a humble Swiss remedy to a Parisian icon, from a symbol of genius to a public menace, the Green Fairy has completed her long, strange trip. You can order a glass now. Perform the ritual, watch the beautiful louche, and raise your glass to a drink that has survived moral panics, political bans, and decades of neglect. She has returned not as a destructive force, but as a beautiful, fascinating piece of history. A quiet reminder of a time when a simple glass of green liquid could change the world. The lights in the bar are dimming now. The noise of the city outside is fading to a soft, distant hum. The glass of green liquid before you looks more and more like a gentle, glowing star. Its light a soft invitation to rest. The history we've just explored is a long one, full of twists and turns. But you don't need to hold on to all of it. Just let the final images linger in your mind. The slow drip of water from the fountain, the beautiful, milky cloud in the glass, the gentle, herbal scent of fennel and anise. Let the stories of the past melt away like a sugar cube in water. The artists and the politicians, the poets and the peasants, they are all just figures in a painting now. Their passions and their fears belonging to another time. There is only this moment, the gentle thrum of the fan, the soft hum of the night. It's time to let go of the journey and sink into the peaceful quiet that follows. You are safe here. No more history for tonight. Just a soft, green lullaby to carry you off. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Just drift.